This video was made possible by viewers like you, through the Wait in the Wings Kickstarter and Patreon. The time is 10 a.m. on March 22nd, 1982. A crowd of over 1,000 demonstrators gather in front of a flatbed truck converted into a stage next to Times Square in New York City. The backhoe already demolished 3 historic theaters, and the fate of the final 2 hung in the balance. In 45 minutes, Joe Papp, the artistic director of the Public Theater, will announce the protest has failed.
Let me hear you say shame as loud as you can. Let him hear it all over the goddamn world.
In 50 minutes, 179 protesters will be arrested. In 300 minutes, 2 more historic theaters will be no more than a pile of rubble. The destruction on March 22nd, 1982 wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the final act of a decades-long battle fueled by backroom deals, political power plays, and a band of actors determined to stand up to the machine. It was a battle that pitted a city's past against its future and started a Broadway civil war. And it all came down to one building: a Marriott Hotel. A large part of our research was gathered from Act 2, Actors, Activists, and the Transformation of Times Square, a 2019 graduate thesis by author and journalist Harrison Hill, Razzle Dazzle, The Battle for Broadway by Michael Riedel, and interviews we conducted. Journalist Roberta Gratz received a frantic phone call from 2 friends on the New York City Landmarks Commission. Thanks to the smash hit musical A Chorus Line, 45th Street in New York was finally on the upswing. However, much of the Times Square area was still steeped in sleaze. Peep shows, burlesque, explicit films. Times Square could satisfy any vice. But back on the phone with her friends from the Landmarks Commission, Roberta Gratz learned that the long-abandoned Portman project was back. And so was the planned demolition of 5 historic theaters. They told her, "Oh, Bertie, you have to write about this. No one is paying attention." By the late 1970s, New Yorkers viewed historic preservation in a different light. After losing landmarks like the original Penn Station and nearly losing Grand Central Terminal, preserving historic buildings was no longer seen as a nostalgic cause. Rather, people started to view it as an act of civil duty. Thanks, Jackie Kennedy. Out of the 5 theaters facing demolition, 3 still operated as legitimate Broadway theaters: the Morosco, the Bijou, and the Helen Hayes. The other 2, the Astor and the Gaiety, were turned into movie theaters in 1925 and 1943. Their marquees looked much dirtier than when they opened in the early 1900s, but their unique personalities still came through. The distinguished Morosco housed 7 Pulitzer Prize-winning plays, including Death of a Salesman, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, and Our Town. Right next door, the cute little Bijou couldn't stage a hit to save its life. No matter what show went into it, it always flopped. Things got so bad, the Bijou briefly became a movie theater as well, before taking a crack at live theater once again with the play The Enemy is Dead. It immediately flopped, and so did the 6 shows that followed. Granted, this came at a time when Broadway itself was struggling. Annual attendance in 1972 barely hit 5 million, compared to 10 million just 4 years earlier. Still, to Roberta Gratz, it didn't make sense. Tearing down 5 theaters seemed like a horrible plan to revitalize the literal theater district. The journalist responded to her friend's call to action and wrote an article for New York Magazine. Published in November 1979, the piece focused on the 3 legitimate theaters under threat, but paid close attention to what many felt was the crown jewel of Broadway: the Helen Hayes. Covered in turquoise, gold, and ivory terracotta tiles, the Hayes made 46th Street pop. It launched Audrey Hepburn's career with the play Gigi, introduced the world to Bela Lugosi as Dracula, and produced Eugene O'Neill's Pulitzer Prize-winning play Long Day's Journey into Night. Gratz advocated for the endangered theater's survival. She even cited a 1978 staff report from the New York Landmarks Preservation Commission, which found the Helen Hayes to be unquestionably of National Register quality and considered for landmarks designation. A city landmark designation came with major protections. If the Hayes received it, it would be practically impossible to tear down. That's what made it so fishy that city officials seemingly ignored the recommendation entirely. Not to mention, the report failed to mention any of the other historic theaters surrounding the Hayes. The city's lack of action also didn't make sense to Sandy Lundwall and Lenore Loveman of the Actors' Equity Union. Years before this, Equity feared taking a side on the issue of the Portman project, since many of Broadway's top producers favored the new development. A 1974 New York Times article even said, "Just about everyone in show business is hoping that Portman's project will be erected and will give the district a stimulus toward recovery." But the Gratz article gave Equity a newfound confidence to pick a side. In the weeks following the article, Sandy Lundwall, Lenore Loveman, and 5 others formed Equity's Committee to Save the Theaters. Their goal was simple: investigate how the Portman project returned, and more importantly, find a way to stop it. The Great Depression hit Times Square hard. Once the central hub of New York City, thanks to subway lines, gorgeous hotels, and countless Broadway theaters, by the early 1970s, it was on the brink of collapse.
You have one mayor in the 70s, Mayor Lindsay, who tries to change things. He tries to make things economically more viable. He creates the TKTS discount ticket booth to make tickets more affordable. But then he also creates tax incentives so that anyone who's building skyscrapers, investing in Times Square and the theater district economically, if they include a theater in their building, he'll give you remove zoning laws, give you tax breaks to incentivize it.
New Yorkers needed jobs. Officials needed tourist dollars. Times Square needed a symbol that the city's luck was changing. A massive hotel could provide all 3. This is John Portman, a developer and architect known as the savior of cities in decay. A similar problem hit Atlanta a decade earlier. Middle-income families fled for the suburbs and left the downtown area deserted. Having lived in the area for most of his life, Portman believed safety was the key to bringing people back. He wanted to create a hotel where people could meet all their needs without ever leaving the building. In 1967, Portman designed the Hyatt Regency House, a hotel with a 22-story lobby, glorious glass elevators, and a groovy space-age bar. It rose above the city as a downtown icon. Martin Luther King Jr. even named it the Hotel of Hope, since it was one of the only hotels that didn't turn away civil rights leaders. New businesses and restaurants popped up to accommodate tourists in town for conventions, and within no time, the downtown area appeared reborn. Mayor Lindsay hoped the architect could do the same thing for Times Square. In 1973, the mayor announced plans for New York's brand new Portman Hotel. Staying true to his total environment philosophy, Portman described in a press conference, "You'll get into a glass elevator, you'll shoot through a lake and reach the lobby. There will be a sidewalk cafe, but it will be in a glass box, revealing Times Square in a protected environment." the city designated an entire city block for the hotel, placing it in the heart of the theater district between 45th and 46th Street. To make way for the project, they'd need to demolish a couple mom-and-pop shops, an affordable hotel, and 5 old theaters. No biggie. With the theater industry and the city as a whole down on its luck, the loss of the rundown theaters seemed like a small price to pay for a project that promised to bring thousands of jobs and visitors to Times Square. To make up for the loss, Portman's blueprints included a new 1,500-seat venue underneath the hotel, named the New Helen Hayes Theater.
The project falls apart in the mid-70s precisely because of the bad situation in New York that has led to what is viewed as the necessity of the project to begin with. Like, there just isn't investment there to build it.
With the city on the brink of bankruptcy, little interest from outside investors, and no rescue coming from the federal government, officials had no choice but to abandon the project entirely in 1975. But by 1978, New York City got a giant kick in the cotch.
How am I doing? Not too well.
Revitalizing Times Square was a priority for New York's new mayor, Ed Koch. But every project that came across his desk looked more like an amusement park than a metropolitan hub.
Nobody was coming to Times Square. 1/3 of all the hotel rooms were empty. Some of the theaters were dark. At one time, 42nd Street was, in fact, the most dangerous street in New York City, and 20% of all the crimes were serious felonies back at that time.
One plan, the city at 42nd Street, wanted to fill the seedy block with museums, family-friendly restaurants, and a Ferris wheel that showed off the views of Times Square. Koch rejected it immediately, stating, "New York cannot and should not compete with Disneyland. That's for Florida." To him, Times Square needed to appeal to businesses and corporate headquarters. What better way to attract some finance bros than with a contemporary high-rise hotel? In the blink of an eye, the Portman project returned from the industrial grave, with one big condition. The first attempt to build the hotel died because outside investors lost faith in Times Square. Portman didn't want to make the same mistake twice, especially since the budget had grown to nearly $250 million. If the city government wanted his help, Portman needed government funding through a federal Urban Development Action Grant. The city agreed.
And as a part of that grant, Portman is required to survey the current architectural situation on the site. Like, you can't use federal funds to tear down old historic buildings.
Essentially a formality to receive government funding, things got complicated when the New York's Landmarks Commission found the Helen Hayes eligible for the National Registry.
These findings are potentially really problematic for Portman. And so the team associated with the hotel, they strike a deal in which they could preserve certain elements of the Helen Hayes Theater, like little statues and pieces of molding. They could do drawings of it, and that itself would constitute preservation, and then they can destroy the theater from there.
Save the Theaters couldn't believe saving statues and taking pictures counted as preservation. What's more, they didn't understand why the City Landmarks Commission report didn't even mention the Bijou or the Morosco. Sure, they weren't as visually impressive as the Hayes, but their rich history had to count for something, right?
The people at Actors Equity realized, look, that history actually can qualify this theater for status on the National Register, and so we've got to try and make that happen.
Lenore Loveman reached out to the Advisory Council of Historic Preservation in Washington, D.C. The Advisory Council was stunned to learn about the two theaters' history and agreed to investigate. A federal investigation might not stop the demolition completely, but at the very least, it would buy them some time to make a plan and gain public support. Save the Theaters figured if they could get 50,000 signatures on a petition to be sent to City Hall, the mayor's office would have no choice but to act. On February 27, 1980, Save the Theaters held their first public rally outside the Helen Hayes Theater. Broadway and Hollywood stars like Patti LuPone and Roy Scheider joined the demonstration and lent their voices to the movement. By the end of the campaign's first month, Save the Theaters collected roughly 1,000 signatures. A promising start, but only 2% of what they needed. Plans to redevelop Times Square existed long before John Portman got involved. In 1969, a developer named Peter Sharp bought up the lots between 45th and 46th Street to build an office tower. Sharp hit a roadblock in the form of the Piccadilly Hotel. Built during the height of the Art Deco movement, the now aging Piccadilly was the furthest thing from a luxury hotel. But it got the job done in its own charming way. So much so the owners refused to sell it to developers. But come 1980, Portman wasn't using money to get the Piccadilly. He was using political influence. By teaming up with the city, the Portman Hotel became a public project. This meant that when the owners of the Piccadilly Hotel turned down his offer, Portman could have the entire building condemned. From there, the city could take possession of the hotel, whether they wanted to sell or not. To stop this from happening, the Piccadilly Hotel sued the city in March 1980. Actors Equity happily joined the lawsuit as a co-plaintiff. The Piccadilly Hotel was as much a part of the theater district as the endangered theaters. The hotel bar was a frequent watering hole for the Shubert organization. One of Broadway's largest theater landlords, the Shuberts were firmly on the side of the Portman Hotel. Longtime proponents of cleaning up Times Square, they figured more visitors equaled more ticket buyers, which equaled more money. The organization also felt the future of Broadway wasn't in intimate little plays and intimate little spaces. It was in big, spectacular musicals in big, spectacular theaters.
It was a question of like what kinds of shows were going to be produced on Broadway. That was kind of the core question. And so to some people, the idea that these theaters were going to be torn down, it wasn't just that the theaters were going to be torn, it was that there was going to be no home on Broadway for these kinds of plays. It was only going to be this tourist-oriented, jukeboxy, like flashy space.
Since the city still hadn't reassessed the theaters for landmark status, Save the Theaters created more and more roadblocks for Portman. In June 1980, Lenore Loveman and Sandy Lundwall tried to convince the Midtown Community Board, Community Board 5, to deny the hotel's development. No one knew if the vote would actually stop the hotel, but at the very least, it would bring more eyes to the debate. When Save the Theaters started attending public hearings, Shubert chairman Gerald Schoenfeld always showed up to share his disapproval of their cause through grumpy stares. Save the Theaters challenged those grumpy stares with a powerful ally named Joan Davidson. The heiress to the Welch's grape juice fortune and overseer of the J.M. Kaplan Fund, Davidson's father fought to save Carnegie Hall from demolition in 1960. Now, she was ready to help Save the Theaters do the same just a few blocks away. During a preliminary hearing in June 1980, countless members of Actors Equity pleaded their case for a full board vote. Gerald Schoenfeld sent the Shubert's corporate relations director to argue that the Portman Hotel would create thousands of jobs, revitalize the theater district, and bring in over $200 million in tax revenue. The crowd of actors weren't convinced. One attendee even shouted, "Of course the Shuberts want to destroy the theaters. The company doesn't own any of them." The accusation wasn't far off. Demolishing the theaters would practically hand the Schuberts a Broadway monopoly on 45th Street. What's worse, planning documents uncovered from the Piccadilly lawsuit listed the Schuberts as the prospective owners of the new theater in the Portman Hotel. Schoenfeld himself even asked director Michael Bennett, set designer Robin Wagner, and lighting designer Jules Fisher to make plans for their dream theater. Plans he then gave to Portman. After hearing both sides, Community Board 5 voted to vote in July. The fight over the Portman Hotel ignited an all-out civil war across Broadway. Actors were against actors, ushers against ushers, designers against designers, producers against producers.
So many people within the Broadway community really did not support Actors' Equity in its fight to preserve these theaters. People like Hal Prince, producer of all these amazing shows, director of Sweeney Todd, Everything Company, Follies, all that kind of thing. So he decried, quote, the impracticability and diluted high-mindedness of the actors trying to save the theaters. He was like, no, we gotta tear down these theaters, which, kind of blows my mind.
Nobody was immune to picking sides in the battle of the Bijou, Marasco, and Helen Hayes. Not even Helen Hayes herself. In the fight to save the theaters, Helen Hayes stayed unusually quiet. Known as the First Lady of the American stage, the theater on 46th Street took her name in 1955. Initially in honor, the glamorous Helen Hayes Theater lost much of its luster by the 1980s. Many referred to the space next to the theater as Piss Alley, since it was a great spot for a bio break. Lenore Loveman and Sandy Lundwall took the actress out for drinks at Sardi's, a favorite bar for those in the theater industry, in hopes they could gain her support. After a brief chat, the three went for a tour of the Marasco Theater. Hayes retold stories of her glory days performing in the theater, and even remarked that the space wasn't nearly as bad as people claimed. A few days later, Helen Hayes wrote a letter to John Portman.
I will say, though, Marc, I uncovered something that you are going to love. Hold on. You want me to read her letter?
Yeah. Oh my God, you've got her letter?
I have her letter. On July 26, 1980, Dear Mr. Portman, you are as nice as your voice on the phone and every bit a Southern gentleman. I must confess that I'm not on the side of saving old buildings in New York. New York should be a city of aspiration thrusting up into the skies, and it should be the most exciting and fascinating city in the world. Therefore, cheers for the Portman Hotel. I don't like to confess this because I hate to hurt people who have a different idea about me, but I did tell the Actors' Equity people whom I met after leaving the mayor's office that I was not about to join their battle. I hope they give up soon and let you get on with the building. Sincerely, Helen Hayes.
Wow.
As far as she was concerned, her theater was a flea bag. Something she even told Portman over a phone call. When the final vote of Community Board 5 rolled around in July 1980, Save the Theaters entered the fight without Broadway's First Lady on their side. But they did have Joe Papp. Papp knew a thing or two about fighting urban planners. In the late 1950s, he took on New York City Parks Commissioner Robert Moses over free Shakespeare in Central Park. The two battled in and out of court for years until Moses finally conceded and built the Delacorte Theater just so the Shakespeare performances wouldn't ruin the park's grass. Papp made his first public statement on the theater demolitions during the Community Board 5 vote. declaring, "The Portman is not the Messiah. Every opponent of the Portman project is in favor of upgrading the area. We just don't want Portman to destroy our irreplaceable, intimate, legitimate theaters." Throughout the debate, more than 50 people shared their thoughts with the community board, and Actors Equity presented a petition with nearly 30,000 signatures. Loveman and Lundwall previously ran into problems with many preservationists who served on Community Board 5. In their eyes, physical architecture outweighed stories of the good old days. Save the Theaters tried to overcome these objections, but in the end, Community Board 5 voted to approve the hotel 23-15. 5 months later, Actors Equity learned that the owners of the Piccadilly Hotel settled out of court with Portman. They allegedly agreed to sell the hotel and the final piece of land needed for $9 million. By the end of 1980, all the pieces looked to be falling apart for Save the Theaters and falling into place for Portman. No matter what roadblocks Save the Theaters put in the way, Portman managed to jazz hand around them. Ironically, the biggest roadblock didn't come from a lawsuit or from Save the Theaters. It came from the very thing that made the Portman Hotel possible in the first place: the federal government.
Ladies and gentlemen, Governor Ronald Reagan.
In his campaign for president, candidate Ronald Reagan promised to cut wasteful government spending and handouts. And he viewed the Urban Development Action Grant as one of the biggest handouts of all. Not great news for Portman, especially since it was the only reason he considered the project again. The hotel was far too risky for private investors alone. Portman needed that grant. And if it didn't happen, neither would the hotel. Frantically, Portman's team tried to push the grant through before Jimmy Carter handed over the White House keys to Reagan, but they were too late. The grant was denied on a technicality. They were told the soonest they could reapply was March 1981. Unfortunately, in February 1981, Ronald Reagan formally announced plans to eliminate the Urban Development Action Grant. Things were also looking bleak for Save the Theaters. Actors Equity found itself in a $400,000 budget shortfall that forced them to lay off many of their employees, including Lenore Loveman. Out of the job, but not out of the fight, Loveman continued her work with the Committee to Save the Theaters as an unpaid volunteer. After a few months stuck in a holding pattern, the battle rapidly sprung back to life. One week, Ronald Reagan changed his mind and decided not to cut the Urban Development Action Grant. The next, the federal government told New York City to reevaluate the theaters for landmark status, or they would do it themselves. Portman and Save the Theaters fought back and forth in a political ping-pong match until the biggest announcement arrived in April 1981. John Portman officially received the Urban Development Action Grant for $21.7 million. Game, set, match. With the grant secured, Portman's project gained a powerful new momentum that seemed impossible to stop. Save the Theaters tried everything. They lobbied, they protested, they advocated. No matter what, Portman always came back stronger than ever. Maybe the only way to save the theaters was to join the very project threatening them. Architect Lee Pomeroy believed in preservation over demolition. He was the type of guy who converted old mint factories into artist studios in Brooklyn. As a member of Community Board 5, Pomeroy knew the Portman project well. In a bid to find a compromise, Actors Equity approached him about coming up with an alternative design for the hotel. Pomeroy accepted, and worked around the clock to draft a plan that embedded the historic theaters directly into the hotel itself. Like all of Portman's hotels, the lobby was designed to sit above street level. Pomeroy realized that by rotating the hotel 180 degrees, the Morosco and Helen Hayes theaters could survive, while still allowing Portman's signature atrium to rise directly above them.
It seemed like a way to kind of have it both ways. You could have this hotel that would hopefully reinvigorate the area economically, and you could also preserve these theaters by just sort of letting them be enveloped in the bottom.
The City Planning Commission felt differently and rejected the idea as expensive and impractical in 1981. The hits kept coming. The city finally completed their reassessment of the Morosco and the Hayes. They reported that no major historical events took place in any of them. With time running out, Equity took the gloves off and filed a lawsuit to have the sites reevaluated by the U.S. Department of the Interior. In their assessment, the department disagreed with the city and found the Morosco and Hayes eligible for the National Register. The Department of the Interior acknowledged the theater's historic significance, but that alone wouldn't save them. The final decision fell on the Advisory Council of Historic Preservation, which faced a difficult choice. They could either approve the Portman project and accept the loss of 2 historic theaters, or find a way to preserve Broadway's past. Just 27 hours later, the Advisory Council made their decision. The demolition would continue. The speed of the decision left Lundwall and Loveman confused. The government was a lot of things, but fast wasn't one of them. Reviews like this usually took weeks to months. How could it have possibly happened in less than 2 days? The answer, it turns out, went all the way to the top. Immediately after the Morosco was deemed eligible for the National Register, the Advisory Council received threatening phone calls from 2 people high up in the Reagan administration, stating, either the council rolls over on this issue, or it's out of business immediately. Why was the Reagan administration so focused on demolishing old theaters? Well, during his campaign, Reagan received help from many businessmen with deep pockets and special interests. One of these men was J.W. Marriott, founder of the Marriott Corporation. As luck would have it, the same month Reagan changed his tune on the Urban Development Action Grant, Marriott announced it would manage the Portman Hotel in Times Square. Not wanting to lose their jobs and considering Reagan's rampage of government cutbacks, the Advisory Council felt they had no other choice but to approve the theaters for demolition. That December, the New York Times published an article confirming the political interference. Just like a newspaper article launched Equity into the fight to save the theaters in 1979, the New York Times report led Equity into its largest lawsuit in 1981. The union filed cases in state and federal court arguing that the Reagan administration pressured the Advisory Council into approving the demolition. Around this same time, the Astor and Gaiety theaters fell to the wrecking ball. Equity's lawsuit only protected the 2 theaters deemed eligible for the National Register, the Helen Hayes and the Morosco. This left the poor little bijou defenseless. On a snowy morning in January 1982, a backhoe slammed into the 65-year-old theater and tore it to the ground. The cries of protesters shouting "shame" rang out over the falling bricks. Later that month, playwright David Mamet screamed at Gerald Schoenfeld outside of Nicholas Nickleby because of his stance on the hotel. Mamet yelled, "You call yourself a producer, but you don't know how to create anything. All you know how to do is destroy." Schoenfeld snapped back, "Well, you don't know how to write plays." Schoenfeld brushed off the insult. After all, he was on top of the world. The Schubert organization won a lawsuit that allowed them to buy theaters again. A chorus line was raking in millions of dollars a week, and their newest Michael Bennett hit, Dreamgirls, looked like a shoo-in to win the Best Musical Tony Award. Schoenfeld may have been winning on every front, but the fight over the Portman Hotel wasn't over yet. Save the Theaters spent months playing legal hot potato. Demolitions would be blocked one week, granted the next, then overturned again. Save the Theaters knew time was running out. For the past 2 years, they'd been playing this game behind closed doors. It was time to take the anger to 45th Street. March 1982 could only end with one survivor: the theaters or the hotel. Across the street from the ruins of the Bijou Theater, Joe Papp stood with a microphone and a petition. Up to this point, the producer sat on the sidelines for much of the preservation efforts. But once the Bijou fell, it was clear that Save the Theaters needed someone who knew how to put on a show. And Joe Papp knew how to put on a show.
But look at the price they expect us to pay for the construction of this monolithic monster by Mr. Portman. New York is not just made up of buildings and hotels, it's made up of people and theaters.
An influential force in the entertainment world, Papp recruited a star-studded lineup of celebrities to voice their thoughts against the Portman Hotel. This included Superman actor Christopher Reeve.
Well, finally, there's one time I wish I were Superman, because I would stand there and just catch the wrecking ball and tear it apart.
Golden Age musical star Celeste Holm.
Dear Mayor Koch, stop the demolition of the Morosco and the Helen Hayes theaters until the Broadway issue is resolved.
And Broadway icon Liza Minnelli.
We can do it! It's an amazing thing, but maybe we can do it. Let's see what happens. Sign the petition.
But perhaps the most important voice appeared at the end.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am Sandy Lundwall, co-chair of the Committee to Save the Theaters. Now, the lawyers have called and told us that Judge Fuchsberg has granted a temporary stay through this Thursday, at which time he will then decide whether or not to extend the stay. You can help make that happen by raising your voices now, continuously.
The 2 remaining theaters were safe for another 3 days. Another 3 days for Save the Theaters to stand up and make their voices heard. Another 3 days to garner as much support as they possibly could. After the rally, Joe Papp went to Mayor Koch's office with a simple request. He knew they were on separate sides of the issue, but he needed a permit for his flatbed truck. He wanted to turn it into a stage and make their case to passerbys. Mayor Koch said, sure. For the next month, the theater industry took over 45th Street with a series of rallies. Joe Papp set up a war room by booking 3 suites in the Piccadilly Hotel that overlooked the Morosco. He didn't want the theater out of his sight, just in case the demolition crew tried anything when the sun went down. In the day leading up to Judge Fuchsberg's decision, Save the Theaters held a dramathon. For 24 hours, troops of actors took to the flatbed truck stage and read all 7 of the Morosco's Pulitzer Prize-winning plays in the freezing cold. Arthur Miller himself even read a passage from Death of a Salesman. By the end of the marathon, Joe Papp received word. The theaters would live a little bit longer while the New York State Court of Appeals debated the case.
We're going to keep these theaters alive. We have very little time. We have a couple of weeks really to garner great support. We're going to call on people again to come out and help us win this fight. Thank you. See you at the barricade.
A few days later, the State Court of Appeals approved the demolition. Save the Theaters appealed the decision one more time. Now, the only thing remaining between the existence of the Morosco and the Helen Hayes was the United States Supreme Court. This was it. The last chance to save the theaters. If the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case, the fight was still on. If it rejected it, the battle was over. The court planned to make its decision on March 22nd, 1982, only leaving Save the Theaters 5 days to make as big a ruckus as possible. Each rally brought more attention to the cause, and the number of protesters grew from the hundreds to the thousands. While Save the Theaters demonstrated to the public, Gerald Schoenfeld pulled strings from his office at the Schubert Organization. After he convinced Helen Hayes to go public in her support for the hotel, many of her theater friends tried to get her to change her mind. Hayes was so uncomfortable with the whole situation that she even told John Portman she didn't want the hotel theater to be named after her. The days raced by as Papp and Schoenfeld fought it out for the attention of the press. Save the Theaters placed hundreds of phone calls to legislators and city officials while their protesters continued to fill the streets. Neither camp gave an inch, with both sides believing their way was the only way New York City, Times Square, and the theater district could survive. Then, on March 22nd, it all stopped. The Supreme Court made their decision. 2,000 miles away, Ed Koch enjoyed a relaxing vacation in Puerto Rico when he received a call from one of his assistants. The voice over the phone said, "If we're going to do it, we should do it now." In New York City, Joe Papp marched into the conference room of the Serena Coin ad agency. He hopped on a radiator and yelled, "Arrest me! Arrest me! They're going to have to arrest me to get me out of the way." Back in Puerto Rico, Ed Koch simply said, "Go ahead," to his assistant, hung up the phone, and walked to the pool. A fired-up Joe Papp took to the flatbed truck stage to address over 1,000 protesters standing, waiting to hear the decision.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, the entertainment portion of this program is now over. We are now moving into what we call the reason we've gathered here together. I'll tell you very frankly, these theaters are going to come down because the Supreme Court has lifted the stay. Let me hear you say shame as loud as you can. Let them hear it all over the goddamn world. Shame! Shame! Shame!
In one last act of civil disobedience, Papp stirred up a news story for the world to hear.
Okay, stand by. All those people who are willing to be arrested for this extraordinary cause, very carefully watch the traffic, cross over to the other side of the street.
The group of protesters made their way across 45th Street to stand on the empty lot where the Bijou Theater once stood and block the backhoe from tearing down the Morosco.
If you're under 21 and you want to be arrested, you have to have your parents here. Shame on Marc! Shame on Marc! Shame on shame! Shame on shame!
4 minutes later, the police moved in and gave all the protesters the option to leave without being arrested. Everyone stayed. As the police started making their way through the lot, the protesters sang the song Big Yellow Taxi. "179 protesters were arrested, including celebrities like Colleen Dewhurst, Susan Sarandon, and Richard Gere. Christopher Reeve wanted to join, but his Superman contract meant he couldn't be seen getting arrested. All the protesters were charged with trespassing, released, and then immediately returned to the protest site with their pink tickets proudly displayed. The police said they were the most distinguished perpetrators they'd ever arrested.
First, I want to pay my respects to all the people that are wearing this pink badge of honor. Great bunch of people. It's both a great victory for New York and a great defeat for New York. But the victory is here. We are determined that this entire district will be declared an historic district.
And with that, the machines started their hum as a backhoe named Godzilla lurched forward and the crowd started to sing America the Beautiful. The bucket raised and slammed into the Morosco. Nothing happened. It tried again. Nothing. Under her breath, Colleen Dewhurst said, "Go ahead. Fight back." The backhoe rammed into the theater again and again before suddenly, violently, it tore through the mezzanine. The Morosco fell into a heap of rubble. Later that night, Philip J. Smith of the Shubert Organization headed to see a show in Washington, D.C. Between watching the demolition and seeing Joe Papp get arrested, it was quite an eventful day. Much to Smith's surprise, when he arrived at the National Theater that night, he was directly across from Joe Papp. Smith asked, "I thought you were arrested today, Joe." To which Papp responded, "Oh, I have a deal with the police." Everything that morning, from the protest to the trespassing to the arrests, was orchestrated by Papp himself. Ever the showman, he coordinated the entire stunt with the New York Police Department from the Piccadilly Hotel. Papp told them it would only happen if the Supreme Court lifted the stay order. They also agreed on the system of tapping the arrestees on the shoulder to keep things peaceful and orderly. To avoid chaos and to accommodate for the amount of police fans needed, it was agreed that the police would simply move through the lot. When they tapped you on the shoulder, you were under arrest. The scenes from inside the police van felt less like a mass arrest and more like a day tour of the city. Everyone inside, police included, exchanged jokes, talked about the sights, and reveled in the thrill of standing up for their cause.
Here I am.
Do you want to with me? On my way. Company your
Here I am on my way to be arrested for the very first time. And I don't even use drugs.
Throughout the morning, Papp continuously checked in with Commanding Officer Mickey Schwartz, who was so nervous about the spectacle, he didn't even have time to put on his uniform. Save the Theaters might have lost the battle, but they were going to win the war. The Marriott Marquis Hotel opened on September 4th, 1985. The final price tag rang in at $450 million. John Portman invited the members of the Save the Theaters Committee to the opening. They declined. Honoring the wishes of Helen Hayes, the 1,500-seat theater simply took the name the Marquis Theater. After championing the hotel from the very beginning, the Shuberts expected to play a central role in its future. Instead, Marriott handed operation of the new theater to their rivals, the Nederlander organization. It was a bitter defeat, made even worse by what happened at the 1982 Tony Awards. In a stunning rebuke from the theater community, voters passed over the Schubert's Dreamgirls and awarded Best Musical to The Nederlanders 9. When a loud bang interrupted the ceremony, one of the presenters responded,
"Don't tell me they're tearing this one down too."
The audience responded with raucous applause. The opening of the Marriott Marquis signaled that Times Square was once again open for business. It gave investors confidence to make large-scale investments in the area, and it gave theatergoers some pretty nice bathrooms. Even though Save the Theaters lost the battle for the 5 theaters, their destruction ultimately helped them win the war for Broadway. The images of the once majestic theaters lying in ruin shocked New York. Add in the news footage of the Morosco 200 getting arrested, the Morosco 179 didn't really sound as good. And soon, the city was ready to act. Save the Theaters became a non-profit organization, and for the next 6 years, fought one battle after another against the Schuberts to get state landmark status for all eligible theaters. In 1982, only 2 Broadway theaters enjoyed such a status. But by 1987, Save the Theaters brought that number up to 28. As of 2026, all eligible Broadway theaters are historically landmarked and protected from demolition. Theaters are more than just some rooms filled with velvet seats and expensive lights. They're symbols of where Broadway has been and where it's going next. The fact that Eva Noblezada can perform The Great Gatsby in 2026 on the same stage where Ethel Merman performed Annie Get Your Gun in 1966 is astounding. In an art form as temporary as theater, the ghosts of all those past performances often only live on through the scuffs and scratches of the buildings. These marks become more than imperfections. They become a connection to the artists that came before. A group of passionate advocates on a tiny committee in the 1980s knew this. And despite the odds, they won the war. They achieved exactly what they set out to do. They managed to save the theaters. But where do you stand on the debate? Should they have kept the theaters, torn them down, or found a compromise? Comment your thoughts below and click on this video to learn all about how they turned a different old theater into a pro wrestling restaurant.